Hustler Casino Live's $1 million cash game truly lived up to its name, as we could see multiple $1 million pots, including
the biggest pot in the history of televised poker.
But what is actually happening in these hands, and what can we take away from them? In this first pot, Doug Polk opens the cutoff and gets 3-bet by Tom Dwan in the small blind, who has pocket 7s. Doug calls with 4-5 suited, which is completely fine, and could even go for a 4-bet according to this preflop simulation made in Simple Preflop. Yes, it is also a custom sim which considers the 1000 big blind plus stacks. Since there are 2k and ante in play and stacks are so deep, Tom can very well play a calling range in the small blind besides a 3-betting range, and we can see that pocket 7s could be in either one. Now, if you're a poker player, flopping a set with $1 million behind is likely one of the best wet dreams you can think of. Tom decides to go for a half-pot c-bet. If given the choice between 30, 50 and 75% pot, the solver would basically only use the 30% option and bet almost its entire range. So let's instead pretend that Dwan would use 50% as his only sizing and proceed with that simulation. Now there's less c-betting going on overall, but 7s would bet most of the time. Facing the 50% bet, Doug decides to float with 4-5 of spades. Floating a hand which can turn straight and flush draws on a lot of turns is in line with the solver strategy as well, but it would only happen in 50% of the time. If we look at this note if stacks were shallower, we can see that this would be less of a thing, and the less we have left to play with, the less valuable hitting potential backdoor draws gets. The turn is a 6, which does in fact give Doug an open-ended straight draw. Tom goes for another 50% bet, which the solver doesn't like that much. On this board, it would prefer to bet bigger with a rather polarized range of aces plus and bluffs, and get more value against a range which includes a lot of medium hands and draws. Or go for a smaller size of 30% and bet a bit wider with king queen plus and even some pocket 10s, jacks and queens. Against the bet, Doug decides to go for a raise with his straight draw.
115.
And Doug's gonna raise.
Which wouldn't be the solver's choice. Instead, it would choose bluffs from combo draws like 4-5 or 8-5 of diamonds, and also a lot of 6x with a flush draw. These block Tom's potential set and 2-pair combos, while also having the flush equity. In order to still have bluffing candidates on flush rivers, the solver would also add in a small amount of 7-8 and 7-9 suited hands as a bluff. These also block sets, but are also likely used because opposed to 4-5 suited, they could even be called by worse, namely Tom's ace-high flush draws, which would call the raise, and on brick rivers, 7-8 and 7-9 suited could just check behind and win at showdown. And taking a quick glance at the value hands that are raising, we can see sets and king 7, but pocket deuces wouldn't even raise that often in this sim. And if you haven't noticed yet, pocket kings are also in this range. So according to the preflop simulation, the cutoff would actually only call kings about 50% of the time instead of 4-betting, which I find pretty surprising, and even Doug himself said he would likely mostly 4-bet them.
I don't really know how often I have kings. I think I'm almost always 4-betting kings.
Tom then ends up in a weird spot because apparently Doug showed his hand to his neighbor Wesley when the flop hit.
It's a little weird, he saw your hand.
Processing these information takes a little too long for Doug's taste, so he calls the clock on Tom.
Alright, I'll call the clock.
Who then decides to just call. With more than 800 big blinds behind, we should also rarely see a re-raise in theory. 7s would do so with some frequency, but calling is the standard play. The river pairs, and after Tom's check, Doug shows some heart and fires out a healthy 420k bet, just under 1.5x pot. The solver would go for a big bet, even though it would prefer the pot size. 4-5 of spades would however be in that bluffing range, if it was still in there, and we can see that even against that size, all of Tom's 1-pair hand would fold more often than not. Dwan thinks for a long time, gets the clock called on him again,
And if you see quads, you see quads.
and finally just calls.
You win.
I know I win, probably. The
Uh-oh.
question was just if I'm shoving or not, dude. What the fuck? It's if I shove the river or not. I'm never folding. It's if I shove the river or not.
This might look like a tight play at first glance, but with these ranges where the cutoff still has a bunch of pocket kings and would never be betting pocket deuces for this size on the river, Tom's combo of 7s is actually just calling, even in theory. He is simply blocking 6-7 suited and King-6 suited, which are some of the cutoff's most frequent calls that he beats. However, winning $500,000 in this pot would soon pale in comparison to what happened in this hand. Wesley is on the button and 3-bets the hijacks open. Besides the $500 small blind and the 1k big blind, there is now also a 3k ante in the pot as well as a 2k straddle. That's why the hijacks open is 7k and Wesley's 3-bet with ace-king is 30k big. Dwan is in the straddle and wakes up with queens, so he 4-bets to 100,000. Against the 3-betting range, which still contains many weaker hands like suited broadways and lower pocket pairs, queens are a clear 4-bet. However, when faced with a 5-bet to 275k, queens quickly start to look a lot weaker and would actually start to fold sometimes according to the solver. The GTO 5-betting range still includes some ace-king suited and bluffs like suited aces, but only calls ace-king off and even pocket kings most of the time. And while many players might in reality only ever 5-bet aces and maybe kings here, Wesley is the type of player who could definitely turn up with a weaker hand here, which is proven by the fact that he does in fact 5-bet ace-7 suited shortly after this hand.
And there's the call.
Tom calls and the flop comes 8-8 3 suited. Wesley bets 125k into 562k and Dwan calls after a short while. If we give the solver the option to bet Wesley's bet size of 22% but also 33 and 50% pot, it would never use his actual sizing. Instead, the solver would go for the bigger options, try to build the pot and use the advantage that the button's top 50% of hands have over the straddle. However, let's again assume that Wesley only uses the 22% size, which the solver would also use as a range bet. And even against that size, queens without a diamond already mix in folds. On the 5 of hearts, which basically changes nothing with these ranges, Wesley does in fact find the solver's preferred bet size with his 43% bet. And it would also be used with close to his complete range. But ace-king isn't always one of those hands. In fact, only the combos with a diamond, no matter if ace or king, would be barreling, because they block Tom's ace-king and ace-queen of diamonds, which would sometimes check raise and force Wesley to fold. Now, queens are calling almost purely, and kings are leaning more towards folding. They simply block ace-king, which by now has turned into Wesley's most frequent bluffing hand. Tom eventually calls, the river is the 6 of clubs, and we see Wesley pretty quickly go all in.
All in.
There's the all in.
He said all in?
He said all in.
For sure? Look at this.
He said all in.
Yes. Okay.
He could jam all his aces and kings here, as well as basically any ace-x bluff, except for ace-king. Here, his actual combo is the only one that always barrels off on the river. Now, having diamonds isn't necessarily preferred, because we don't want to block folds, which would be our opponent's missed flush draws. However, we only bet diamonds on the turn, so we can't really be choosers here. Well, actually, we still can. Of those diamonds, we now rather jam the aces instead of the kings, simply because our opponent would be more likely to only check call the turn when their aces included a diamond, because they block our flush draws. And aces without a diamond would often jam. Therefore, by having the ace of diamonds on this river, we would less often be up against the slow played aces, which would always pick up our bluff. Now, whether Wesley actually knew he had one of the best combos or not remains a mystery. However, I would lean towards no, just because the way he spoke about the spot in the interview after the hand makes me think he would likely be barreling off any ace-king combo he would get there with.
So I think I did right thing, because I can't just bet and give up on the river. That's not what I do.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's what my play.
True artist, huh?
Yeah, I have to do 3-bet run, give him the max pressure.
But of course I could be wrong. In Tom's shoes, facing the all-in is simply a 0 EV bluff catch scenario. No matter if he has kings, queens or jacks. He does think about the fact that now Doug saw Wesley's hand.
Doug saw his hand, tried to talk him out of 3-betting. He 3-bet anyway.
And maybe he was also able to read something off of Wesley's body. But eventually he calls and makes history.
There's the call!
I call?
Call.
Tom Dwan has just won the biggest pot in the history of televised poker. $3.1 million.
Tom Dwan has been making history for years now. If you want to see how his strategies looked like long before solvers were a thing, this video will be exactly for you.